Hi everyone, I'm Stephen and welcome to Watch Out. I picked up this Felicia ladies watch on eBay for $15. The description said it might have flat battery. I don't think that's the problem. It would run for a little bit when I got it, but I found the more I wound it, the more happy it was to run, to the point that it's keeping pretty good time. But it no doubt will be pretty dry and will need a service. So my idea is that this will be for my mum, who recently celebrated a significant anniversary. This is the third watch that I have worked on. This isn't going to come out, is it? So I might just have to leave that end of the strap in there. That's okay, I can still get the back off. Yeah, my mum would not appreciate it if I went out and bought an expensive watch for her. She'd be much more grateful to receive something like this that is a personal gift from me. So the 8 ball's not getting the back off, which is quite common, so I'll just need to stick the movement into this holder, and then I'm going to have to use the watch back removal tool to just get me a bit of purchase like so, and get this case back unscrewed. These lugs are really a little bit too big for this, so I probably should actually be using my other tool that's got changeable lugs on it. I could put smaller lugs in, but anyway. And this is coming off, so we'll get this off. Do the last bit with the 8 ball, there it is, it's off. It's good just to use a casing cushion like this, just to try to protect the watch. So there's the back off. See what it looks like on the time graph, and yeah, it doesn't look good, does it? It looks pretty awful. All over the place. So this movement is a variation of the 69-21, which was the last movement I worked on. But one of the differences is this arrangement here. It doesn't actually have a setting lever screw. The setting lever spring actually holds the setting lever in place. So you just push it down on it like that, and you can get the winding stem out, which of course is necessary to get the movement out. Now we've got this kind of a ring made out of this light metal that just holds the movement in place. Now we can take the movement out of the case. So there we are, we've got the movement in the movement holder. And the first step will be to get the hands off. This plastic bag just protects the dial as I use these hand levers just to prise the hands off, like so. Just got to get it underneath there. Up they come, there we are. And I've got a little plastic box. It's just like a membrane box. It's got a very thin, tightly stretched piece of plastic membrane which just holds the hands and protects them. The box is really cheap, so I might as well have it and use it, which I do. Okay, so now we need to get the dial itself off, and there are 2 little screws, which is surprisingly enough are called dial screws, and we just ease those off. There's a couple of pins that are attached to the back of the dial itself that go down perpendicular from the dial into the movement, and they hold it all in place. So just by loosening those 2 screws off, we can just ease the dial out of the movement, which probably makes it sound a whole lot easier than it is, but once it's all freed up, it does tend to sort of come out, all being well. So there we go, we've got that loose. We just need to get that off there, like so, and we just get that out of the way. Okay, that little brass dial washer. Now the hour wheel. Get that out of the way because it'll just fall off otherwise. Now just put the winding stem back in, pushing down on the setting lever spring so that we can get it back in. Make sure that's all working the way it's meant to, because Yeah, so I noticed that the watch, it didn't feel right when engaging and disengaging from hand setting to winding, and that's why you'll notice that the actual setting lever spring is not working properly. It's bent out of position, so that's probably going to need to be replaced. So we just need to let the power out of the watch now, which is done just by holding back the click and just easing the power out, ideally through my fingers, allowing the crown to rotate slowly, hopefully, through my fingers. Although I haven't had a lot of luck because it either seems to not go at all, and then as I release the pressure on my fingers, it then all of a sudden seems to go all at once, which isn't really what one wants to happen. But anyway, there you go. Yeah, so you can see that the setting lever spring itself is actually broken off now. So that part is definitely going to need to be replaced. It doesn't stop the watch from working, but it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't have that nice positive click when you change between winding and hand setting mode. So anyway, we'll take the balance out. It's sort of the first major component to come out. This is also the most delicate part of the watch, and I guess the smaller the movement is, probably the more delicate it is as well. So one screw holds it in, we just prise it up with the screwdriver like so that it's free, and then we just carefully take it out like so. We just want to put that aside. I must confess that so far my struggle has been with balances. I'm still sort of like learning how to handle them and try not to drop them like that. And a lot of it is just because of compromised wrist position, I think, is trying to turn things. So fingers crossed that balance may have actually been damaged in that drop. I've got to learn how not to do this. But anyway, we'll press on. Take out the setting lever spring now. As I mentioned, this part is actually broken, but it kind of like helps to hold the works together. The keyless works, it stops them from flying apart, which is really important. The yoke spring is underneath this and is held in place effectively, so it can't fly out by this plate. It doubles as a plate, so it is quite important. Two screws out, and yeah, there it is. So yeah, you can see that's the yoke spring there, and I'm holding it down because this thing can fly, and if it flies, I'll be down on the floor looking for it. And I've already spent enough time in this hobby crawling around on the floor, and I don't want to spend any more down here by choice. But once the tension's actually taken out of it, it's much less likely to fly away. It doesn't mean it can't, but it's less likely to. So this is the actual yoke itself. Now there's supposed to be an intermediate wheel there, and it's not there. So where did it go? There it is. It's stuck to the bottom of the plate. That's okay, as long as we know where it is. And this is the setting lever itself. And see how it's got that pin underneath it? Normally that would be the setting lever screw, but this one doesn't work quite that way. Okay, so now we can take out the pallet fork. So this is the pallet fork bridge or the pallet fork cock. Just one screw holds that in place. And this is the pallet fork itself. Out that comes. Now, this is something that's quite different to the arrangement in the previous movement, 69-21. This is a 691N variant of it, But this one has a second center hand. There's no second hand at all on the 69-21. So there's this extra bridge, and you'll see when we get it apart, but it actually taps some power off the fourth wheel. The fourth wheel, you may recall if you know a bit about how watches work, the fourth wheel is the one that you use to drive the second hand. So they've kind of tapped a couple of wheels off the fourth wheel to drive a long pinion that goes through the center wheel to drive the second hand. Oops, I'll come back here. These screws do have a tendency to go flying away, but fortunately they don't usually go too far. So yeah, this is like this extra bridge that isn't on the 69-21, and it's used just for the extra stuff for driving the second center hand, but it also holds the fourth wheel in place. So the fourth wheel's not held by the main bridge, it's held by this extra bridge, which means you can't actually turn the train of wheels without both bridges being in place, which is a bit of a pain, but it is what it is. So yeah, you see there's that wheel there. That's driven by the fourth wheel. And then in the center, you'll see there's that spindle that we're going to get out. So I'm not sure what this piece here actually does, just sort of looking at the arrangement. I mean, I can tell that the bit in the middle, it works together. It works to hold that spindle in place, but I'm just wondering whether is this supposed to provide some upward spring tension as well? I'm just not really sure exactly what it does. But anyway, yeah, so there's that long spindle, and the very end of that is where the second hand goes. Okay, so this is the crown wheel. Again, we note, as usual, that screw is reverse thread. It's so easy to get that wrong, even though it's a relatively large screw. Put a bit of force into it, turning it the wrong way, and you'll ruin the screw and potentially the movement. And then this is the ratchet wheel. Out that comes. One of the tricky things I've found with this movement being so small is that the movement holder is kind of like screwed up all the way so that it's very narrow. So sometimes when you're working on things towards the edge of the movement, the whole thing wants to tip, which is a real pain. Now this is interesting. This is the click, but there's no actual click spring as such. So again, this is something that's different from the 69-21. The click serves the function as, I mean, technically it's not a spring, but it still serves the function. So that's quite interesting. I guess it means there's one less part to go flying, because certainly the click spring is the other part that's most likely to go disappearing on one. Okay, so now we've got the train wheel bridge. Take its screws out, give it a little prise with the screwdriver, and it comes free. Just make sure that everything's nice and nothing's binding up before I take it out. There we go, set that aside. That's the fourth wheel, take that out. That's the third wheel.
It's not through the slot.
Escape wheel. Okay, that's how that goes, angling into that funny slot there. Keyless works. And that's the mainspring barrel falling out, because it's just going to fall out at some point. Get that out of there. So we want to get the cannon pinion off now. And yeah, see how small it is compared to the size of the tool. I'm not sure whether this is actually going to work. There are other tools you can get, like Presto tools. I do not have one. Yeah, I think I'm just not going to be able to get enough purchase on it with this tool. So I actually did this on the last movement. The cannon pinion was actually loose on the last movement, so it did come off with the tool only because it was loose. But I had to take it off because I think I over tightened it, or I can't remember now. But anyway, you can do this being very, very careful. But so notice how I've got the brass tweezers on the plate to give me that leverage, and the brass tweezers are relatively soft, and that worked. That's out. So that's the center wheel out. But you don't want to damage the cannon pinion doing that, because if you do that, you're in big trouble. Okay, so now the mainspring barrel. Just want to get the lid off. Yep, that's off. So disengaged the arbor from the spring itself. Want to make sure we don't lose the arbor, because again, that's a very small part that will involve lots of crawling around on the floor. And we need to get the spring itself out of the barrel. And I'm trying to do this sort of, again, really carefully. Did I say really carefully? Because every time I've done this, the spring has gone flying away just like that. But anyway, practice makes perfect, I suppose. So after having cleaned all of the parts of the mainspring, it's easy enough to clean them separately and manually. We can reassemble the mainspring barrel, and to do that we need to use a special winder. There's a set of winders that I have that are all different sizes for different size springs, because we need to get it back into that barrel somehow or other. So that's what this tool does. And so there's a tiny little hook that hooks onto where the spring would normally hook onto the arbor, and we can put it inside this tool and we can wind it like so. But you just see how small that is. You know, it's much smaller than the size of my fingernail. Now this end bit here, I've managed to disengage it from the hook, so I can't wind it anymore. But this end bit is supposed to be inside. But I have got a bit of a theory. As long as it all ends up inside the barrel, then it doesn't really matter. So I think I've actually used the winder that's perhaps one size too small anyway. So I wouldn't have actually been able to do that if I'd used the next size up. But let's see if this will work. Give this a push. And look at that. That's what's supposed to happen. So the whole thing is supposed to end up inside, and it is. So now we need to avoid everything going flying, and we need to get this arbor engaged so that the hook on the arbor engages with the little hole on the end of the spring. And I've found this is one of the more tricky things to do in reassembling a watch. It is actually really, really fiddly, but I think we might have got this. We'll give it a little turn to engage the hook, and yeah, we've got it. So we need to lubricate this. There's a few different ways you can lubricate it. Last movement I put the oil on beforehand and I ended up with way too much oil. This is a special oil that is for lubricating mainsprings. And so what I'm going to try this time is to do it this way. The idea will be that the oil will just work its way into the spring and lubricate it that way. So having done that, we just need to put the lid back on the barrel. And so to do that, I've got this special little tool, which is like really cheap because it's just a piece of plastic. You could also do this with your stiff tweezers, I think would be fine on the staking block. But hey, we've got the tool, we might as well use it. Give it a push. Make sure it's lined up properly, and yeah, that worked perfectly. Okay, so we need to get all the other parts cleaned. And so I've got these little brass baskets. I still like to keep the parts together by function because it just makes it a little bit easier to know exactly where everything goes. Yeah, the Rodico is good for picking things up that don't like to be picked up sometimes. The pallet fork and the balance do not go through this cleaning process because you'll destroy them if you do. They have parts that are held on with a kind of a adhesive, and the normal cleaners that you use for cleaning will eat them. So we get that into the ultrasonic cleaner. I've got the baskets inside the little jam jars that have got isopropyl or rubbing alcohol IPA in there, and the medium in the cleaner itself is just water. Okay guys, I've just got a little bit of a mystery here that's throwing me a little bit. We're looking at the jewel here for the escape wheel. Now, on the last movement that I did, which is a variation of this, it had a cap jewel, so this is a two-part jewel. And on the last movement there was a screw, and you took the screw out and then the cap jewel would come out. On this one, if I look at the other side, you can see there's the cap jewel there, but it looks like it's mounted into the main plate. And then on this side you can see there's this funny little ring here with these there's these three notches. So I don't know whether there's like some special tool that you're supposed to use to take this out. If it is, I certainly haven't got the tool, and I think if I tried to do anything without the tool, I'm almost guaranteed to break it. So I don't think there's anything I can do, but if anyone knows for certain, please do let me know down in the comments. I actually took this up to my watchmaker and asked him what he would do, and he said he just put some oil in through the hole. So that's probably what I'll end up doing, but I'd really like to know whether there is a special tool or there's some special way to actually disassemble this jewel, because it is definitely a two-part jewel. This is the jewel with the hole in it. It has a cap jewel on the other side, but I can't see how to get it apart. So I'm just going to put some oil in there and just take away the excess with the Rodico. Right, so I've got all the parts cleaned now, so we can start putting this back together. I cleaned the main plate separately. The yoke spring I also cleaned separately because the last couple of movements they were actually working their way out of the brass baskets, and I found them in the bottom of the glass jars. So I've kind of learnt from that mistake. Center wheel goes in, escape wheel, and then this is the third wheel. Which means this is the fourth wheel. Yeah, you can probably see it's got that extra little set of teeth at the very top there, which is to drive the second hand. So now we need to put the train wheel bridge in place. There are some YouTubers out there who seem to be able to magically drop these things right on first time and all of the pivots magically line up with the holes. Well, that's never happened to me, and I don't even bother anymore trying to get it to do that. I just kind of get it more or less in the right place, and then I just use my fine number 4 tweezers just to manually line up the holes. And honestly, I don't think that's any slower than trying to do the magic trick that might look good on YouTube, but I'm not sure how realistic it is. So yeah, I've found that it doesn't really take me that long to actually get these lined up. Third wheel's in. Get the center wheel to stay in. We just need the escape wheel in. Have we got them? Not quite. I think that's it. Yeah, that's it. It's just a bit tricky because the fourth wheel, as I mentioned, is held in place by that extra bridge. So the train won't actually function correctly because the fourth wheel's just hanging in the breeze. But we can still get an idea as to whether the pivots are all correctly located and free is what they need to be. And so before we clamp down all of these screws all the way, we need to make sure that that's the case. If one had, for example, happened to pop out and you screwed this all the way down, you could actually bend or snap a pivot, which would be the end of that wheel. You'd need to get a new one. What you might notice too that I like to do in my technique is I like to put the parts that I'm actually about to use next, like these screws, I'll put them on the main plate so that they're there. Then I can just transfer them from their resting place on the main plate to where they need to be. A lot of that is to do with planar vision. I'm working under the microscope, and because I'm working under the microscope, it means that in the z-axis, in the height axis, there's only one working distance where things are in focus. So if I have the screws down on the bench, for example, then it's out of focus. I can't actually see them. So I find it personally a whole lot easier if I just get all of the parts that I need to use next sitting on the main plate so that they're in focus, and I have the minimum amount of distance that I need to pick them up with the tweezers and move them to where they need to be. So we just do these screws up. Yeah, just make sure that these are still free, which they are. So now we can do the final nip these guys up. So once again, make sure that this is all still free, because we've got a big problem if it's not. Okay, we can start applying some oil now as we start working our way. So some oil to the actual mainspring itself. This is the medium viscosity oil. And to the center wheel. Again, the medium viscosity oil. You can see it's got a kind of like a pink or a light purple colour. To the third wheel, again the medium viscosity oil. And the light oil to the escape wheel. Okay, so we can now put in, this is the combined click and click spring. It's not actually a spring. I'm not actually quite sure how it actually works, to be honest. I mean, it obviously does work. Very clever bit of kit. to be honest. You can see how it sort of like slides somehow or other in the plate. It's just the shape of it. Very clever bananas who designed this thing. And so I have a general rule of thumb is that something that slides should have some of this grease, this blue coloured grease. It's a fairly light grease, it's pretty close to oil actually, but it is a grease. So that's my principle that I use. If it slides, I generally speaking use that grease. And so now we can put the ratchet wheel on, having got the click spring into place. And just this is sort of like a sliding surface, so just a little bit of grease up there. And we get the screw in place. So we have two screws that look very, very similar. This one and the crown wheel screw. They're like with the big flat heads. But one of them will be longer than the other one usually, and that's this one is the longer one. The shorter one goes on the crown wheel and it's shorter so that it doesn't foul on the winding stem. It has to be shorter by definition, and it's also usually reverse thread. So I just get a little bit of medium viscosity oil in underneath there. And just hold this while we get it just nipped up. And we can see that the click is engaging and doing what it should do. Okay, just a little bit of oil here also. This is where the click wheel's going to go. Reverse thread. Okay, so we've got these bits and pieces now that drive the second hand that we just need to get in place. So this is this funny little bit which I'm not sure what it actually does. A little bit of, I'm assuming that usually the principle is for the fourth wheel we use the light oil, and this stuff is, because it's driven by the fourth wheel, I'm assuming that it's rotating, well this certainly is rotating at the same speed as the fourth wheel. So I'm going with the light oil on that. It probably doesn't really matter that much. I mean, this is a much larger wheel. So I'm just putting the medium viscosity oil on this one. Because it also, I think it has like some surfaces, like the wheel, it doesn't have a bearing as such. So like, these almost look like sliding surfaces. So this is the medium viscosity oil, which you can also use in some applications, some places. You know, some people will use this instead of that blue grease that I've used in some places. But just because of the nature of what this wheel is and the speed that it turns at, I just feel that this is better to have oil rather than grease. But those ridges, to me, they do look like contact surfaces. So I feel like this needs to have some lube on it like this. As you can see, a lot of this is kind of a bit of guesswork or rule of thumb, whatever you want to call it. And so, yeah, now we need to get this plate, or this bridge in place. So we've got that pivot there, which is actually for our second hand. We need to get that in. And then we've got the other pivot is for the fourth wheel. Once that's in place, we should actually be able to turn the whole train, should turn properly. Like so. So we just want to get the screws in for this as well. This one especially likes to make the movement holder tip because, as you can see, it's sort of like over near the edge. Just push the wrong way with the screwdriver and the whole thing will tip over. Which is probably not really good when the bridge isn't screwed down. Okay, make sure everything is still free before we nip it all the way down. And it's still free. Okay, so we keep on with the lubrication, center wheel, and the fourth wheel. And we'll want some lubrication on the dial side of the movement as well. So we've got these jewels that are sort of like buried down in here that are really quite tricky to get to, but they still need their lubrication. This is for the escape wheel and the third wheel, I believe. Yeah, this will be the third wheel. Bottom of the barrel. And now some of our blue grease, because this is where the cannon pinion is going to go. And our stiff tweezers, just push it straight on like that. A little bit of oil down in there. Now we can start working on our keyless works. So the winding pinion goes in and we just put some lubrication on that. Parts that slide across one another, so again the blue grease. On these faces, and this is the sliding clutch that allows us to switch between winding and hand sending modes and also transfer that power to where we want it to be. And then the stem as well, we want some lubrication on the faces of the stem. We're not trying to drown it in lube, but make sure that the various mating faces are lubricated. So we put the stem back in place, because obviously we can't actually put any wind in the watch until these parts are back in place. So we can't really test it properly or check our work until we've done this. So this intermediate wheel will go on here. This is the one you recall got stuck to the bottom of the setting lever spring, and it has a chamfered side. The chamfer goes down. So the minute wheel goes on here. If we can get it lined up, that is. There we go. Okay, so this is the setting lever itself, and that shaft that we just lubricated, that replaces the setting lever screw in effect. It's just held in place by the setting lever spring will also hold that in place. There's like an extra spring that holds that there. And now this is the yoke. A little bit of lube on there because that rotates around that post. And some grease in there. You can see that notch, the actual yoke, engages with that notch. Okay, so this is the yoke spring now. This is the one we definitely don't want to go flying away, as it is prone to do. So very carefully holding it with something as I actually put the tension on it. And don't engage the stem. Don't move the stem in and out unless you're holding it down. So you can do it like this just to make sure that it is working properly, but hold the spring down because otherwise it will disappear. So now we want to put the setting lever spring back in place. Now you recall this is actually broken. I have ordered a new one. It hasn't arrived yet, but I'm just going to put this one back in for now because, as I mentioned earlier, this is what holds all of these things in place, especially so that the yoke spring can't go disappearing on us. So the watch will still work perfectly fine with a broken setting lever spring. It just won't have that nice positive click as we pull the crown in and out. And I think that parts secured, held down so they can't go flying is a good thing, right? Okay, so that's hand setting mode, and that's something's not right here. That's supposed to be winding mode. Notice in winding mode, it ain't turning. So something is wrong. Yeah, look at that. See how the winding pinion is turning slightly, but the crown wheel is not budging. It didn't move at all. So I would say that I have got something wrong with the crown wheel. So fortunately, I have had to take that extra bridge off to be able to access it, which is a bit of a pain. But aside from that, at least I don't have to pull the whole watch apart to access it. And yeah, so the issue was actually that I had it upside down. So because it was upside down, it's not symmetrical. When I screwed that big screw down onto it, it basically just acted like a great big clamp and stopped it from turning. So we just had to flip that over and get that back in there, and hopefully it should now turn like that. That's better. So we'll just have to put this extra bridge back on. And I've actually done that off camera because I didn't want to bore you guys by seeing that being done again. You know how that's done. So we need to put the pallet fork back in now, and I cleaned that separately in some One Dip to a specialist cleaning solver which won't dissolve the glue. And so having made sure that that's kind of engaging correctly with the escape wheel, we just need to now put this little bridge back in place, line up the pivot, there we go, and get the screw into this thing. I always think that's a good thing is get screws in as soon as you can so the bits won't go disappearing. All of these parts do have like locating lugs that will make sure that they align correctly, and they will generally hold them in place just on the locating lugs, but it's very easy even so for parts to just come out. So we just make sure that's kind of lined up correctly, and it is, so we just nip that up. So we'll just put a little bit of wind into the movement, because we're going to need a bit of wind for the next step, and that is to actually lubricate the teeth. Each individual tooth on the escape wheel has to be lubricated, and there's a special way that we do that, and that's to put some oil on the face of the exit stone, and then we just rotate it kind of about 5 teeth more or less, and then we add some more oil and we do the same again. I've kind of got a bit too much oil on the top there. It's supposed to be on the face, not the top, so I'll just clean that up a bit. Again, I think it's a case of practice makes perfect, really, but it's probably coming in not at the right angle, so if we just try to slightly change the angle so that we're coming in at the face rather than the top, yeah, that's a bit better. Get that on there, and around we go. So every time that happens, each one of those little teeth, or feet, or whatever you want to call them, is picking up a little bit of oil, which will keep it lubricated. So I just want to make sure I've got sufficient oil on each one of those. Whoops, got a bit much oil on the oiler there, but anyway, that's all right. So around we go till we make sure that we've done them all. And now just use the Rodico to clean up the excess oil on that jewel. That's kind of better. People commonly leave that step out, so I wanted to show you that. So now we need to get the balance back in, and this is quite tricky, especially on a movement this small. And part of the reason why it's tricky, not just because it's small, but because the position, see how where it is compared to the actual movement holder itself, the holder gets in the way, so it's a real pain. But we've got it in. So again, let's just get the screw in place so that it can't go anywhere, can't fall out. Let's put a full wind on it and see what it looks like.
Not running properly. See the way that the springs are kind of like grouped together up the top there? That's not right. Every time that's happened, I've had to replace the balance to fix it, and I do have a balance. I know I dropped this one once. It wasn't a bad drop. I know why I'm dropping it. It's because of the way I'm trying to turn my wrist over.
So anyway, before we can resolve that, we do need to get these end stones cleaned up anyway, cleaned and oiled. So each one of these end stones is 2 parts like so, and we need to get these out, get them apart. Sometimes they'll just fall apart on their own. If they don't, they'll usually come apart in the cleaner, so I'll just put them in the one dip. I just give them a bit of a clean in the one dip. And now, having cleaned them, making sure that they are cleaned on the flat side, so the outside, the top side is curved. On the flat side, I put this oil and put it back together like so, and back in the movement. Come on, line up with the pivot U. In you go. And we just re-engage the spring. So this is what kind of like shock proofs a watch. Like before they actually invented this spring system, if you dropped a watch, those pivots would break. Well, there's a good chance that they'd break and you'd be in big trouble. It could be the end of the watch potentially. So these springs now, they allow the jewel to move and so absorbs a lot of that shock. So this is actually what they call the Inca block system. If you see a watch or it's got Inca block on the dial or it's advertised as Inca block, it's this. It also makes it a little bit easier, in my opinion, to actually clean and oil the jewels, because like before they had the Inca block system, if you look at older watches, they'll have two really, really teensy weensy screws that actually hold a cap jewel in place, and you have to take those two screws out. They're like the smallest screws that you've ever seen in your life. And they're so easy to lose, but you've got to take those two screws out to take the cap jewel off and clean it and put it back together and so on. So you don't have to do that anymore, because instead you have this spring, which is much easier, in my opinion, to work with. Alright guys, this has been incredibly frustrating. I think I said on the last movement that I almost gave up, and I came even closer to almost giving up on this movement. This movement is actually a variation of the last movement I worked on. That was a 6921. This is a 691N. So it's basically the same movement with a few variations. It's got this extra bit on top, which you've already seen, so that it has a center seconds sweep. It's sort of like this gearing arrangement that is driven by the fourth wheel. But there's a couple of other little differences as well in terms of how the setting lever is secured, which means it has a different setting lever spring. But because of those few differences, it means a bit of confusion in part numbers, and sometimes you get the wrong parts sent to you, as you'll see. But anyway, long story short, this does seem to be running properly now. I've had it on the time grapher, as you saw. It seems to be keeping reasonable time. The amplitude is down a little bit from where I think that it should be, but it does seem to be keeping time, so that's something. This, believe it or not, is the fourth balance that I have had in this watch. 4 balances. I just can't keep doing this, and this is why I think I got so close to giving up altogether and canning this hobby. And I've wanted to be honest from the very beginning. I wanted this so that people would not watch other people's watchmaking videos, think it's really easy, try it themselves, and get really frustrated and spend a heap of money for nothing, because it's very, very easy to do that. It's very easy to make this look easy on YouTube. So I wanted to be honest about what it's like starting from the very beginning, and I think I'm a reasonably technical sort of a guy. So anyway, the background of what happened is ultimately I think it was a mistake for me this early in my journey to work on small movements like this. So my first movement that I did was a larger men's movement, ST96. This movement,
ST69 and its variants, it is a ladies' movement. It is much, much smaller. The smallness hasn't really stressed me. I can see what's going on underneath the microscope, so getting it apart, getting it back together has not really, the smallness hasn't been a problem. What it comes down to, though, is that in a smaller movement, the balance is smaller and therefore even more delicate. The balance is the most delicate part in the watch. It must be perfect. Otherwise, the watch will not run properly. It might run, but it won't run properly. It won't keep time. Commonly what happens, trust me, I know, is that it will run, but it'll have really low amplitude, and because it has the really low amplitude, it will run really fast. So you'll be gaining, a couple of hours a day, so it's absolutely useless. So I think it was a mistake for me this early in my watchmaking journey to work on small movements with a delicate balance like these in these ladies' movements, because I have not learnt the techniques yet. I don't have the skills to correctly handle the balance without breaking it. And that's why, or part of the reason why, this is the fourth balance that has been in this watch. Now, I've got some ideas as to what I did wrong, but intellectually knowing and actually learning the motor skills and being able to do it with your motor skills are two totally different things. So it was a mistake to have the second and third movement that I worked on being these ladies' movements, and the next one that I work on will be a men's movement. But I just want to describe to you some of the issues that I did have with the balance. So the first balance, this watch, when I took it apart, it was actually keeping time quite well, I thought, but it was really, really dry, so it did need a full clean and lube, which I've done. But again, when I took the balance out, just in terms of technique of learning how to handle the tweezers, I did manage to slightly drop it. It wasn't a hard drop, but when I put it all back together, it did not run properly. So I actually had a spare balance, which was the correct balance from the last movement that I worked on, the 6921. It's the same balance across the two movements. So I had a spare new old stock balance, and I put that balance in, and I managed to mangle the balance. So I just want to show you what I did wrong so that you won't make that mistake again. I'm just going to have to change the angle of things a little bit here. Right, so what you are looking at is the regulator arm, and you can see how so you've got the end stud there, which is the end of the balance spring, and then it's heading off to the right and it wraps around inside the regulator arm. So the regulator arm slides back and forth, and that's what you use to adjust the timing of the watch. So you can see on the left hand side there is that pin there, and that pin is basically like on a cam arrangement, so you can move the pin in and out. It needs to be positioned such that it basically holds so it will stop the spring from popping out of that slot, but it still needs to be able to move. So the mistake that I made is that I had that cam pin such that it was jammed up against the actual balance spring. So when I moved the regulator arm, the balance spring was jammed in there, and it just bent, it just mangled, it just bent, it put a big kink in the balance spring, so that was the end of that balance. So that's what happened with balance number 2. So I then had to order another balance on eBay. One of the problems I've found on eBay, especially when you have a bunch of variations around the same kind of movement number, is that you can often get sent the wrong part. So I certainly ordered the correct part, but what came was this, and it's just the wrong balance. So, and I've also found this is much more likely to happen when you use these sort of like non-original parts. So this one was from someone who had a big drop-down list of movement numbers, and I selected the right movement number but sent me the wrong part. So that was balance number 3. Balance number 4, fortunately, they sent me the correct part. So in a minute, I'm going to tell you how I put it back together that I think helps keep the balance a lot safer. But the other frustration with ordering parts on eBay is sometimes they can take 3 or 4 weeks to come. So every time something goes wrong and I need a new part, that's another 3 or 4 weeks. So I've been working on this watch for months now. I mean, it's probably 3 months, I'm not sure. But fortunately, the last balance came from the UK and it arrived in about a week. So it came really, really quickly. So I'm very pleased about that. And I used a slightly different technique because I think balance number 2, which is the one I mangled, I reassembled the balance into this balance bridge into the balance bridge out of the watch, sort of with the balance bridge upside down and doing it that way. And that is kind of quite fiddly and possibly part of the reason why I got the spring jammed. So what I did in this one, which worked quite well, and I will do this in the future again if I need to reassemble, is I put just the balance itself in first. And the usual technique that you use to make sure that the balance jewel is engaged with the pallet fork. So I did that, made sure it was engaged. Then I I pre-adjusted this cam with the pin on it so that it was sort of out but not all the way, so that I thought there was enough room for the spring to sort of slide into the right position. I then sat the balance bridge in position. I put the screw in to hold it in place to make sure it wouldn't all fall apart. I needed to slightly slacken it off because I then needed to arrange this stud here so that it couldn't. There's actually not enough clearance if this is down all the way, so I just needed to back it off a little bit to get this stud in position. So I got the stud in position. Then under the microscope, made sure that this was engaged, adjusted the cam, and when it was all in place, wound the watch, and bang, it sprang to life immediately. I haven't actually wound this again since yesterday, so it's probably down a bit on power. There we go. It's looking a little bit healthier. So, so that's basically the sad story as to how I got there. I've still got a little bit of work to do on this watch, but famous last words, fingers crossed, hopefully we are near the end. But this is certainly the biggest bit of progress that I've made recently in the last few months. So let's press on and see how we go.
So I had to reorder the setting lever spring because the first one they sent me the wrong one. So anyway, I now have the correct part, so that's something. So out will need to come the older broken one. Just a couple of little surfaces on here that I didn't actually oil just when I put it together. So just a couple of these surfaces, sliding surfaces again, the principle of grease, and also this little post here is what's going to engage with the actual setting lever spring itself. So in goes the new one. Engage it with the setting lever. There we go, there it is. And just a little bit of oil on there because that intermediate wheel rotates obviously. Clean the excess up and the screws go back in. and we make sure it actually works. Yeah, that's the idea. Okay, so the hour wheel can go on now. And the dial washer.
Both of the dial screws have fallen out. Oh no. I guess that'll be them there.
Yeah, I guess they just worked their way out while I was cleaning the main plate. I've sort of like learnt my lesson. This isn't the first time I've found parts floating around in the bottom of jars. So I don't actually empty the jars out or throw them away or put them away until I've finished the job altogether, just in case something's gone missing. I know where to go looking for it, so we just need to get these screws back in, because we can't put the dial back on without them. Right, so let's get the dial itself on. Let's get it lined up with those holes. There we go. Now just tighten up those screws and that will hold it in place so it can't go anywhere. That's the idea. Okay, so now we can put the hands back on. So some of the, I guess, the most obvious things in watchmaking are not so obvious until you actually get it wrong. So perhaps what is obvious that isn't so obvious is that when you do this, you need to have the hour hand on the hour, on any hour will do, but then the minute hand has to be at 12 o'clock. And then obviously if you're dealing with a calendar mechanism, then it's a whole lot more complicated than that. But for non-calendar, this is really just the only caveat, is make sure that the hour hand is on the hour and then the minute hand is at the 12 o'clock position. And then obviously the second hand doesn't really matter. I just love that red colour. It's just so striking, beautiful. Quite a bit of patina on the dial. I didn't really attempt to clean the dial. It was pretty obvious that this patina was not going to come off, so I just left it. So to get it back into the case, we need to take the stem out, obviously, like so. And yeah, we just put the movement into the case. And then we've got this little locating ring, or whatever you call it, that will hold the movement in the right place relative to the case. I mean, this is what allows you to use the same movement across all sorts of different looking cases, is just having something like this that takes up the difference in size between the movement itself and the case and the dial. So I just make sure that that's down and located properly. And now we need to put the stem back in. Again, the same way, just by putting in as far as we can, then pressing down on the actual setting lever spring itself, which allows us to, that screwdriver's a little bit too big, smaller screwdriver. There we go, that's it. Allows us to get in the last bit. And so yeah, that's not looking too bad on the time grapher. The amplitude is not good. It should be higher than that. But the actual time, it doesn't look too bad at all. I need to replace the O-ring on the case back because the old one was basically perished and about to break, so I got a new one and we need to grease it. I've got this little greasing box which makes that really easy. Just stick it in there and twist. And now we need to get this O-ring onto the actual case back itself. There's a little space there for it to sit. I'm not sure what the best way is to do this. It's very small and fiddly, and honestly I think sometimes just doing things by hand, you just get that feel and dexterity that you can never get with tools. So it turned out to be pretty easy to get this on by hand. And so now we need to just get the case back on, so we get it started like so. And then we need to tighten it up. Either I can use the tool like this, or I could probably use the 8-ball. Maybe it probably doesn't need to be quite this tight, to be honest. I think as tight as it would go with the 8-ball is fine. And then finally, we need to get the band on as well, obviously, which is a little bit tricky, but we've got the pry bar tool to help us. And just with a bit of persuasion, I think that we can actually get this, yeah, there we go. We can actually get this into place. That's it. Alright guys, I'm going to wrap this video up here. I'm still not convinced that this watch is right because, as you saw, the amplitude is down around 180 degrees or less, and it really should be more than that. I'm not sure what will be causing that. I'm pretty happy with my work. The only thing I can think of is possibly a mainspring issue. I didn't replace the mainspring, and if I've got anything wrong in terms of reassembly, I think it's likely to be around the mainspring. I'm pretty sure the train is fine, pretty sure that the motion works is fine. So all that's left really is the mainspring. So it was keeping time okay. So now that I've got it back together, I'm just going to let it go for a while. Just going to let it sit around, sit on my desk and so on, and see how it goes for keeping time. But I am going to wrap this video up because, quite frankly, I've had enough of this watch. And if I need to do some more work on it, I'll probably do that as a supplemental video. So thank you so much for watching this. This has been really frustrating, or I found it frustrating anyway. Hopefully you didn't find it so frustrating. But as I say, this is so that you can get a really honest idea as to what's involved in starting this hobby from scratch. This is my third movement. I have got it back together. It is running. I have learned a lot on this movement, but I can see I've still got a long way to go. So I don't actually have another watch to work on next. I'm not sure what I'll work on next. I'm certainly not confident enough to move to a calendar. I'd like to do a calendar, but I think that would be foolish at this point. I need to do some more practice. So I think the next step will be to get another men's movement, one that's a fair bit bigger than this, and do some more practice on that and go from there. So I really do hope to see you on that video, whatever the next watch might be that I work on. I'm assuming I don't give up. You can give me some encouragement in the comments. It might convince me not to give up. This has been so frustrating, but it does have some satisfaction and soothing qualities about it too. So thank you so much for watching. Please do subscribe to my channel. It helps me so much. Give me a like, comment down below. You can check out my Patreon, patreon.com/AudioNautica across both of my channels. Check out my other channel, Audio Nautica, which is about hi-fi and nautical content. And I really do look forward to seeing you on the next video. Bye for now, and watch out.